When restraint created an empire, it didn't begin with ambition the way history usually tells it, nor with a dramatic expansion that signaled dominance to the world. It began with hesitation that looked deliberate, with opportunities declined so quietly that most observers never noticed they had even been offered. What appeared to be restraint was mistaken for limitation, and that misunderstanding became the foundation of everything that followed. This story matters today because restraint is rarely recognized as a source of power in modern narratives of success. We are conditioned to associate growth with action, influence with visibility, and leadership with constant motion. Yet some of the most enduring empires were not built by doing more than everyone else, but by doing less at precisely the right moments, allowing time and structure to do work that effort alone could not. The restraint in this case was not moral or emotional. It was structural. Decisions were slowed intentionally, not to avoid risk, but to avoid premature commitment. While competitors rushed to secure territory, partnerships, and scale, one player consistently chose to wait, to observe how incentives aligned and how systems responded under pressure before locking anything in place. At the time, this approach felt counterintuitive. Markets rewarded speed. Investors celebrated expansion. Visibility translated into confidence. Choosing not to act looked like surrendering relevance in an environment that punished hesitation. Criticism followed quietly at first, then openly, as restraint continued without explanation. But beneath the surface, restraint was accumulating leverage. By refusing to commit early, flexibility was preserved. By avoiding scale too soon, complexity was deferred. And by allowing others to define the market through their actions, weaknesses began to surface without cost. Every aggressive move elsewhere revealed information that restraint absorbed freely. This was the initial beat of the story. Not growth, but positioning. Not dominance, but preparation. An empire did not emerge because restraint avoided opportunity. It emerged because restraint allowed opportunity to mature into inevitability. And as time passed, the consequences of that choice began to reshape the entire landscape, slowly at first, then all at once. As the market evolved, the contrast between restraint and aggression grew sharper. Even though most participants continue to judge success by surface indicators rather than structural position, competitors expanded rapidly, accumulating assets, partnerships, and visibility, while restraint maintained a narrower footprint that appeared modest by comparison, leading many to assume it had fallen behind or missed its moment entirely. What those assumptions overlooked was the cost embedded in early success. Each expansion introduced dependencies. Each partnership required compromise. Each layer of scale added complexity that could not easily be undone. While growth created momentum, it also fixed direction, narrowing future choices in ways that were difficult to perceive while returns remained strong. Restraint avoided those costs. By staying smaller for longer, it preserved clarity. Decisions remained simple. Governance stayed flexible. When conditions shifted, adjustment required discussion rather than restructuring. What looked like slowness was actually responsiveness delayed until it mattered. As years passed, the industry began to stabilize. Early growth slowed. Competition intensified. Margins compressed. At that point, the advantages of early scale began to fade, replaced by the burden of maintaining it. Competitors found themselves defending positions rather than expanding them, locked into systems optimized for a phase that had already ended. This is when restraint started to reveal its value. Because it had not committed prematurely, it could move into spaces others could not reach without conflict. While rivals were managing obligations, restraint was choosing opportunities. It entered markets selectively, under conditions that favored durability rather than speed. The shift was subtle but decisive. Influence increased without spectacle. Partnerships formed on favorable terms. Assets were acquired when prices reflected reality rather than optimism. What restraint gained was not dominance through force, but control through timing. And as the imbalance widened, the narrative around success began to change. Growth was no longer the measure that mattered most. Structure was, and restraint had spent years quietly preparing for that moment. The conflict became unavoidable when the market finally demanded adaptation rather than expansion, exposing how differently restraint and aggression performed under pressure. What had once been rewarded as boldness now produced fragility, as competitors struggled to adjust systems built for growth in an environment that required precision, efficiency, and selective control. Organizations that had expanded aggressively found themselves constrained by their own success. Layers of management slowed decisions. Legacy partnerships limited strategic options. Infrastructure designed for scale resisted change. Every attempt to pivot required negotiation, compromise, and time they no longer had. What once felt like dominance now felt like weight. Restraint faced none of these obstacles. Because it had avoided premature scale, it retained the ability to move decisively when conditions shifted. Governance was simple. Incentives were aligned. Resources could be redirected without internal resistance. While competitors debated how to protect what they had built, Restraint focused on shaping what came next. The emotional peak formed as the imbalance became visible to everyone involved. Early leaders sensed control slipping, not through failure, but through rigidity. Their structures could not respond fast enough to a market that had outgrown the assumptions under which they were created. They were maintaining systems rather than steering futures. Meanwhile, Restraint began to assert influence without confrontation. It dictated terms through availability rather than force. When competitors needed access, flexibility, or cooperation, Restraint had offered selectively, on conditions that reinforced its position. Power emerged not from size, but from indispensability. Attempts to counter this shift were reactive and fragmented. Restructuring introduced instability. Divestments weakened confidence. New initiatives conflicted with existing commitments. Every solution solved one problem while creating another, because the underlying issue was structural, not tactical. The conflict was no longer about market share. It was about who could still choose freely. Restraint had preserved that freedom by waiting. Others had surrendered it by rushing. And as the market moved deeper into maturity, the outcome began to feel less like competition and more like inevitability. The climax arrived quietly, without a single announcement or defining moment. Because restraint does not reveal itself through spectacle, but through the absence of resistance when others finally run out of options. By the time the shift became visible to the market, the empire had already taken shape, not through conquest or acceleration, but through years of positioning that made alternative outcomes increasingly impractical. Competitors recognized the change too late. Their systems were heavy. Their commitments were rigid. Their ability to maneuver had been traded away gradually, decision by decision, in exchange for early scale and short-term certainty. What they faced now was not a stronger rival, but a structure they could no longer work around. Restraint had achieved what aggression could not. It had preserved freedom while others accumulated obligation. It had allowed complexity to exhaust itself elsewhere, leaving behind gaps that only a flexible player could fill. When Restraint finally expanded, it did so into a landscape already shaped by others' excess, stepping into roles that had become necessary rather than contested. The resolution revealed a deeper truth about power. Empires are not always built by claiming territory early. They are built by waiting until territory defines itself, until incentives align, and until movement by others makes resistance economically and strategically irrational. Restraint had turned time into leverage, and leverage into permanence. This is why the story matters now, because modern markets still reward speed on the surface, while quietly transferring long-term control to those who know when not to act. Restraint is not inaction. It is delayed action with intent. It is the discipline to let others reveal the limits of their own strategies before committing to a future they can no longer escape. History tends to glorify expansion, ambition, and visible dominance. But the foundations of lasting power are often invisible while they are being built. They exist in the choices not taken, the deals not rushed, and the scale not pursued too early. By the time the empire becomes obvious, restraint has already done its work. Sometimes the smallest shift in perspective becomes the beginning of a new future. When